Thank you, Mercedes, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I think this is, when I hear, the very largest assembly of land change scientists in history. And I don't think it's going to be the last biggest assembly. I think it can only get bigger. So I'm very excited to have this chance to address what I think is going to become one of the most important communities in the global land change effort. As I'm going to talk about, one of the most important things to understand about a species or a planet is its history. How did it come to be? How did it come to be the way it is? How did a single species change a planet? As we know, that's completely unprecedented in the history of the Earth. Types of species, such as photosynthetic organisms, have changed the planet. But as far as a single solitary species, we are the first. So what I'm going to talk about today is the roots, the deep roots of the Anthropocene, how a single species managed to change the planet. And I will say that this is the community that's going to be able to do the science that will help us deal with the fact that we are now firmly in the situation of living on a used planet in which our only hope for the future, or a better future, is the one that we create. We can no longer just depend on natural systems to take care of us. We have to take care of ourselves to a certain degree, and we also have to take care of the rest of nature. So I'll start off just talking about the kind of the big opening question that a lot of people have been discussing about the Anthropocene. When did it begin? And then I'll talk about the emergence of the human biosphere, the Earth that we've created, and I'll talk specifically about land use intensification, which of course I think most of you are familiar with, but I'll also connect it with a basic ecological concept that's also used in the concept of human evolution, but it occurs in other species, which is called niche construction, which is the basis for understanding essentially why we changed the planet. And then finally, the implications. What does it matter that we look at this history? Why does it matter for us now? So I think you're all familiar with this idea of the Anthropocene, in which humans have emerged as a primary driving force in the Earth system, pushing it into an unprecedented new direction. As we know, it's not a simple function. It's not something that any one of us can do. It's not biological. It's social. We could not light up the Earth. None of us can even turn off the lights on Earth. Right now, we have this large-scale system of interactions among us. The emergent properties of all of us interacting together at a scale above any organized human society is now lighting up the planet at night. We have the energy systems. We've built these technologies over many, many generations. Now it is really almost impossible for us to turn off the lights with the current social institutions that we have. So even though we have changed the planet and are continuing to change it, we really don't have our hands on the controls, even though we are doing it. And of course, if The Economist says it's in the Anthropocene, we are in the Anthropocene. The classic view that you hear a lot of, and I'm a member of the Anthropocene Working Group of the International Commission of Stratigraphy, which is currently in the effort of making a formal proposal to create a geological epoch in the formal geochronology of the Earth called the Anthropocene. And right now, the current winning faction in the group believes that we must use the very clear signal of the current time, the accelerations of the current time, as the best benchmark for the beginning of human transformation of the biosphere, at least from the point, of the Earth system, sorry, at least from the point of a geologic signal globally. And believe it or not, you will see this soon. It's a paper now in peer review. This is the proposed start of the Anthropocene that you will see very soon. I'm very disappointed by this, I must say, and I think the land change community is a group that can, I think, reflect back this idea in its true light. But the period of 2 seconds after the first atomic bomb was detonated in Nevada test site is now the formal beginning of the Anthropocene proposed by the Geological Committee. But clearly, you know, things started a little earlier than that, and the process of blowing up bombs has basically nothing to do with the fact that we've changed the planet. I think all of us know from a process point of view, this bomb blast has nothing to do with really dating human influence in the planet. The Industrial Revolution is no doubt a tremendous change, and of course, changed many things. The thing that we focus on the most, for good reason, because it is a train coming down the track very quickly, and the results are very uncertain at a level that I think we've never really experienced before. We're going to enter into a new climate system. We already are entering into it. So this is a big deal. It's a huge, unprecedented, rapid change, climate change. And the process, of course, is dominated by the combustion of fossil fuels by industry. And this started quite a while ago, and it's been building up. I think we're all familiar with that. I think we're all familiar as land change scientists, at least, with the fact that fossil fuel emissions of carbon and methane, carbon dioxide and methane, are the primary drivers of this global warming. But we also have the contributions of land use change, whether they be positive or negative. Land use is a significant factor in driving emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and causing climate change. Well, if we look back a little bit further in Earth's history, we know that climate change and variations in the greenhouse gases are a very normal and natural thing in the Earth system, driven primarily by cycles of radiative forcing caused by differences in the Earth's orbit around the sun. We see these very long-term patterns in glaciation and warm interglacial periods. And as we all know in the far, I guess it's the far right side there, you can see our current geological epoch, the Holocene, which is a nice warm interglacial period. If we look at these glacial, interglacial periods over a very long period of time, we see a very messy signal. But this is, in particular, methane, but carbon dioxide looks very much like this. These are matched glacial, interglacial cycles. And what you're seeing in the middle there is the interglacial. So the warm period is kind of in the middle. You can see it matched up there. This is the matching up of, I believe, 11 different cycles. The one that maybe doesn't stand out unless you look at it more closely is the red one. That is the Holocene, and it is very different than the other ones. The other ones, you have a decreasing greenhouse gas concentration during the warm glacial, interglacial period, and that decrease, of course, leads to declining temperatures and another glacial period. That is the native pattern that we see in most of the previous interglacial cycles. Here we have one different, and it's been proposed that why is the Holocene different? Why do we see greenhouse gases going up in the middle of the Holocene, unlike all the other ones? Is agriculture. Human use of land changed global greenhouse gas concentrations thousands of years ago. That has been proposed by Bill Rudiman, so it's also called the Rudiman hypothesis. It's a controversial hypothesis. Nevertheless, it tells us a lot, and it can be very informative in understanding the big role humans have had in changing the planet very early, long before we ever detonated a bomb on this planet. So these are the general patterns we're talking about here. We have this kind of relatively small, it's only about 20 parts per million increase in carbon dioxide starting several thousand years ago. And then we have this exponential increase in population. And the simple thing you see here, and Rudiman was heavily criticized for this for obvious reasons, there's almost nobody around thousands of years ago. How could so few people create a global signal like this? How could we clear so much land long ago? It just doesn't seem possible or intelligent. The reason is very simple. The way we use land now is very different than the way we used to use land. When there was no shortage of land whatsoever, this is the most intelligent way to use land. It requires almost no labor. The tools were around. You just burn the land and farm at a very low capacity, very low investment of labor, and you are able to produce what you need on a large amount of land, but with a little amount of labor. This is the rational way to use land before you have any shortage of land. And as we know, this process is land use intensification of forcing the land to produce more for us is a long-term process. And Esther Boserup studied it, Billy Turner studied it. It's a classic part of maybe one of the most basic theories in land use science, this idea of land use intensification. As population densities increase, as demand increases on the same land, land becomes scarce, we use land more efficiently. This is a very, very long-term process. And for that reason, if you look at the long-term trend of human use of land per person, we find this is a huge driving force. This land use intensification is a global driving force in the Earth system. If you start off here on the far left, you see a typical shifting cultivation land use per capita. And on the right, you see a typical contemporary land use per capita. And what's interesting is, if you look at how that translates into use of land, how much land is cleared, you see on the right hand there that there is a relatively dramatic increase in total use of land late in the Holocene. But if you look at the lower one, what's interesting there is that you see almost a big pulse of extensive land use early in the Holocene. That's because at that point people are using a lot of land per person, but the populations are growing very quickly, and you put those two things together, the big clearing of land probably occurred a long time ago. We'll talk more about that, but the simple message here is that if you understand land use intensification as a long-term global change process, you will see much bigger effects a long time ago when land use was not efficient, and as it becomes more efficient, we get more effect. So the classic view of the Earth, we just have this natural system basically shaped by climate, the terrestrial biomes, and we know that we've made big changes in that natural system, and the biggest change of all is agriculture. The idea that global climate change is the greatest change that humans have contributed to the Earth is, I think, misleading. In the future, we may get to that point where we have changed the climate system so much that it is unprecedented, outside of any bounds. But the fact is, it's unambiguous that we now use almost 40% of Earth's land for crops and pastures and settlements. We have transformed a huge amount of the biosphere into systems that would never have existed without us. We have a human biosphere. And for Tobias, I'll say, we now have transformed the classic natural biomes into anthromes or anthropogenic biomes. And this is mostly a function of agriculture. But this was not the beginning of the human influence. Even before we had agriculture, we were starting to shake things up. And one great big example from the ecology world is the megafaunal extinctions, which have occurred on most of the continents where humans appear relatively late, where the dominant species, either herbivores or carnivores or both, are driven extinct by human transformation of landscapes and heavy hunting, which causes huge effects on ecosystem structure and function. I think all of you know that when you remove a large carnivore or a large herbivore, the landscape and ecosystems will shift in response. So that's a very early response. But as I'm going to present here, this process of reshaping the biosphere began not just with knocking out these large species, but by the process of niche construction, which is the idea that humans alter their ecosystems to make them more productive. We also alter them to become less productive, but the thing that has enabled us to grow to a level of 7 billion today, incredible number. We could never be supported by natural ecosystems, and we haven't been for most of our history. We have always been niche constructors. We have transformed the land to make it more productive for us. So there's a lot of things that we've done to do this that are pre-agricultural. One of the classic ones that if you're familiar with paleoecology or archaeology, it's called dietary broadening. And it's not something, this is going to be a repeating message, it's not something that you do because you like to go to the supermarket and buy lots of different foods. Once you've hunted out the woolly mammoth, and you've hunted out all the easy game to get, and you've eaten all the foods that are easily available, what do? You have to eat more different kinds of things. And it's very visible in the archaeological record that humans began eating more and more and more species. Okay, that's called dietary broadening. That enables you to get more sustenance out of the same land by just eating more things. We learned to process foods. The grasses that are now domestics were once very unproductive comparatively, and we had to process those grains to make them edible, even to use them at all. And that is an act partly of desperation, but it enabled us to put a lot of species on the pathway toward domestication by making it worth the time, by processing these small grains. Eventually it became worthwhile to actually propagate the species. And we began propagating species before we had proper domestication. But of course this was the road to domestication and the road to agriculture and the road to cultivating the land, the road to plowing the land, irrigating the land, fertilizing the land with manures, and multi-cropping, other really difficult, increasingly difficult, labor-intensive, and technologically sophisticated practices to gain more productivity from the same land. And if you've ever done this, you know that it's not something you do just because you feel like it. It is because you need to do it. Land use intensification is a global change process that has changed the world. We do it because we have to. So first idea here is Bose-Ruppian intensification is merely societies adopt more productive technologies to gain more from the same land when they have to, when the pressures are there. Okay? Once you've done that, there's usually this nice intensification window where you can just basically get more out of the same land without increasing effort. But every technology, every farming system kind of has some limits, and it taps out after a while. And that's called involution, where essentially you have to put more labor in just to get the same amount back out. That's called involution. And that's a time where if you have another technology available, that's the time to adopt it. And for example, the plow may have been available for long periods of time, but nobody really bothered to use it until we needed to use it. Hand tillage was just too much work to get enough food. So that is that period of involution, Clifford Geertz's involution. And then finally, if you can't have access to any technology or your social system is not capable of using these technologies, then you face a crisis. And populations may even drop and serious things happen. But through processes of lots of local adoptions of technology and these intensification processes, globally, we've managed to continually increase the productivity of the same land over time. This has big implications for looking at the history of the Earth. What we see here are two different views of the history of the Earth, shaped by no land use intensification, essentially, where essentially the land use per capita at the top, the Hyde model, the classic Hyde model, I'll call it now, where essentially people use about the same amount of land per capita through most of Earth's history. And what you see there is a planet in which human use of land is not really very significant until recent times. In other words, kind of the view that really nothing big happened on Earth because of humans until recently. But the KK10 model, a new one, which uses an empirical data set on relationships between population and amount of land use, this per capita relationships. This has a historical long-term pattern of essentially denser populations using less land. When you apply this model, you get a planet that has been deeply transformed for thousands of years. You can see some areas are almost completely transformed even 5,000 years ago. And the global amount is about 3,000 years ago. You get a different, of course, climate response. The carbon dioxide emitted, this is work from Jed Kaplan. In the KK10 model, this one that includes intensification, we have much more carbon coming out of the Earth system caused by humans as a result of land use, whereas without that, you see a very low level. And very recently, this has been combined, the emissions have been combined with climate simulations to show that early climate change by humans could have been equivalent to all of the anthropogenic global warming we have now induced by burning fossil fuels. So that early warming effect is maybe as significant as everything we've done so far with burning fossil fuels. This is published in Geophysical Research Letters. It also colors our view of when did the Anthropocene begin. And there's lots of ways to date that, and it's a big discussion. But one of the ways that I think about, because I'm an ecologist, is when did we start bringing most of Earth's land into anthropogenic biomes or transformed ecosystems? And if you look here, these are the two systems again. You have on the left Hyde and on the right KK10. You see on the right a much older early transformation of the biosphere. So we live on a very used planet. It makes a lot of difference. The most important thing is that it has made our lives in many ways easier. Land use is more productive. This is the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. We're not going to go back. All right, this is called the rich farmer, poor farmer poster for a reason. You can tell it's an advertisement for synthetic chemical fertilizer. And right here is the reason why we don't go back. And this is not false advertising. It's in fact true. You can get a lot more productivity out of that traditional agriculture just by adding fertilizer. And now our scales of agricultural production have gone incredibly high. And part of this is driven by urbanization, another intensification process. This urban concentration is driving upscaling of productivity in other systems all around the world, the agricultural systems. It's driving the recovery, it's making possible the recovery of forests in some of these areas that have intensified the most. And now we have these recovering forests all over the world. We have the recovery of species that have essentially been on the road to extinction, partly as a result of the fact that now we don't have to use as much land if we choose to intensify. And nature does come back when we just leave it alone. We can even assist it. We can do something to push it back if we wish. We have that power We can think differently about the way we use land. We can use land even more intensively than we already are. We can all live in the city and all have a little yard with trees in it. That's kind of an amazing idea, but we have the ability to do this. We have been doing this for a very long time. We're not necessarily that good at it, but we're not as bad as you might think. We're not so bad at constructing our niche. These are not humans. These are ancestral species. These are Neanderthals, or at least a parallel species. We emerged as a species among other members of the Homo genus who already used fire, who already had stone tools for hundreds of thousands of years. We emerged, we evolved in that environment. Humans may have never lived in natural ecosystems. We became a species within ecosystems already transformed by these ancient species. So humans are not a temporary disturbance on this planet. We now shape most of ecological pattern and process, and we are now becoming, as a human system, an Earth system on a par with the rest of them. We are a niche constructing species, and we began transforming the planet long before we had agriculture. Land use intensification is what made it possible for us to transform this whole planet. By making the land more productive, we made it possible for us to grow to such large numbers and to have such incredible powers over the planet. This process is continuing, and if we leverage it, if we work with it to move it in a direction in which it can shape the planet in a better way for both society and for non-human nature, we can shape a better Anthropocene. It's up to us. Thank you.